Hello, my name is Eric Chappell, author of AutoCAD Civil 3D 2013 Essentials, and this is the additional exercise for Chapter 16. We're given three tasks for this exercise, and the first one is to create a pond design similar to the one that you created in the last two exercises. We've been given a feature line between lots 62 and 66, represented here in green. And we're going to use the same geometry and the same approach to creating a pond in this area. So to get started, I'm going to go to the Home tab and launch the Grading Creation Tools. And if you recall, our first criteria set that we used was grade to relative elevation, and that's what I'll choose here. I'm going to assume that my feature line is already set to the right elevation, and if I look here by letting my cursor drop into the grip, I can see it's elevation 169 if you watch this number right here. Elevation 169. So that sounds about right. I'm seeing a 170 contour right there. So I'm going to grade to relative elevation from this feature line toward the inside. I want to apply to entire length. Yes. My relative elevation is going to be 7 feet down, which is the same depth that we used for the other pond, the same beginning depth. We edited it later on. And I want to define this by slope. 3:1 is the slope that I want to use. And there we have the inside of the pond. Now if you recall, in order to fill in the space at the bottom of the pond, we need to create an infill. And maybe to show you that, I'm going to split my viewports here into two viewports. So let me switch over to the View command, and we'll do two vertical viewports. And that's going to take just a second to regenerate itself. And I'm going to, here's a quick little shortcut to get your viewport oriented. I'm going to right click that and use Object Viewer to get it in the right orientation that I want with a very simple object. And then I want to look at it the same way in my drawing, so I'll click this button right here, and that'll set my view in the drawing to match. Pretty cool. The only thing I'm going to do differently is I'm going to set my visual style to conceptual, and that'll give me a shaded look at the pond. It's taken just a second to process that information. And there we go. So now it's very clear that we have a hole in the bottom of the pond. So in order to take care of that, we're going to add an infill. Just drop it in right there, and what that does is it permits the triangulation of the surface to exist across that area that we just created. So that takes care of the inside of the pond. Now we want to create the berms of the pond. So to do that, we'll use a grade to distance, and I'll use my create grading command right off of the same feature line. We're going to do entire length yes. Our distance is going to be 10 feet, and we're going to do a 2% grade. So just slope it up ever so slightly so that when rain does fall on this berm, it falls inward toward the pond, not outward. And then we'll continue by grading to a surface, tying it into existing ground. I need to tell it what surface is my target. That's going to be EG. And I'll launch the create grading command using the outer feature line of the grading object we created earlier. Define this by slope. 3:1 sounds good. Slope again. 3:1 once again. And now it's going to create the daylighting for me. And it fits in there quite nicely. It doesn't even require that we do any adjustment to fit it within the allotted area. And you can see in the 3D view we've got a pretty nice looking pond. And that takes care of our first task, which is to create a pond similar to the one that we did in the last two exercises. Our next task is to continue doing some lot grading, namely for lots 27, 28, and 29. So the first thing I need to do is zoom into those lots, which in my 2D view on the left is pretty easy. But for the 3D view, I think to make that go more quickly, I'm going to start by setting it back to plan view. And the way I'll do that is click in the viewport to make it active, and I'm going to use the plan command to set that view to plan view. Now the plan view also does a zoom extend, so I'm going to need to zoom back in to the site plan, find the lots next to it, and use the same object viewer trick that I used for the pond to get it oriented the way I want it. So I'm going to zoom into the site here. And I think the easiest way to do this is going to be to select some of the objects in the adjacent lots that are already graded and kind of get our orientation set up based on those. So we've got a couple of feature lines here I can pick. And I'll just right click, bring up Object Viewer, get those oriented kind of the way I want them, and then set the view. Now I can close down Object Viewer, and I've got a similar 3D perspective set up in this right viewport. Now I'm a big fan of having a 2D and 3D view available anytime I'm doing grading because grading is a 3D design approach, and in my opinion you can't do it effectively in 2D. So to get started, I'm going to create some feature lines along the perpendicular lot lines. So I'll just go to Feature Line, Create Feature Line. I want to make sure I get the right site, so I'm going to click the Pick from Drawing button for the site and select another feature line that I know is in the same site that I want, and that happens to be lot grading. The style I'm going to use is also called lot grading, and I'll click OK. My start point, I'm going to snap to the front end point of the lot line, and I'm not going to worry about the elevation. I'm just going to let it be set to 0. But then for the back lot line, when I snap to the end point, I want to base that on a surface. So I'm going to type SU for surface. I want my surface to be EG. It's going to pick up the elevation of EG at that location, and I'm going to accept that as the default, and that'll set the back lot line to the correct elevation. I'll hit enter to complete the command, and then I'll do that again for lots 28 and 29. So just repeat that same sequence. Luckily it's saved all my defaults from before, so I don't have to do all of that again. And again, I'm going to use surface. It's already remembered that my surface is EG, so that step is taken care of, so it gets a little quicker each time. I'll repeat the command, snap to the front end point, enter, snap to the back end point, use the surface option, existing ground, and that takes care of those 3 feature lines. And if I take a look at my 3D view, I can see that everything looks pretty good. It looks like it's I don't have anything shooting way down to elevation 0, or it looks the way I would expect it to look in 3D. So now I'll create a feature line along the back lot line. So I'll just use the same command, create feature line, and I'll start by snapping to this endpoint here. Notice it picked up an elevation of 0, so I'll go ahead and use the surface option once again because I want this to match EG. It looks like I've got a straight shot from one end to the other, so I'll just snap to the other endpoint here. And once again use a surface elevation of EG. Now the problem with that is the shape of the surface or the terrain is not a straight line from one end to the other. It actually has some ups and downs. In fact, looking at the contours, it looks like we kind of are climbing to a high point right here where this line ends. So we need to have that taken into account in the design of the elevations of this backlot feature line. So to take care of that, we're going to use the elevations from surface command. I'm going to click on the feature line. I'm going to bring up my edit elevations panel and use the elevations from surface command based on the EG surface, and I want to make sure this insert intermediate grade breakpoints is turned on, because that's going to create additional elevation points everywhere that there is a tin line underlying the feature line. So you probably saw the little green circles there at first. Now those little green circles have all become elevation points, and this backlot line now is a much closer match to the existing ground surface. In fact, it's a perfect match now to the existing ground surface. Now for the building pads, to make life easy on myself, I'm going to copy those from lot to lot. I'll take this first one and rotate it so that it's a little more parallel to the road. If I wanted to, I could get real particular about the rotation of that, but just keep in mind we are designing dirt here. It doesn't need to be super accurate in this case. And the next thing I want to do is set those building pads to the correct elevation so that I have the building pad being the highest point, not only the highest point within the lot, but the highest point that creates at least a 2% slope toward the outside of the lot. So that's what we'll take a look at next. So in order to establish that minimum 2% slope, the first thing I need to figure out is what's the highest point on the exterior of the lot. And a quick way to do that is using the quick elevation edit tool right here, because I can move my cursor around on these feature lines and it will tell me in a tooltip what the elevations are. So that's 190.7, that's 190.5, that's 192, and that is 192, so I got to check these again. 192.6, 192.4. So this point right here is the highest point on lot 27. So what I do now, I'll escape out of that command. I'm not actually going to use that command. What I am going to use is the elevation by reference. So raise lower by reference. That's this one right here. So I'll launch the tool. My reference point is going to be the high point right there. And the object that I'm raising is on the building pad right here. And I'm going to say that I want a grade of 2% between those 2 points. And I think something went wrong because my feature line disappeared. So let's undo that. And I'm thinking maybe I didn't snap to the right location. So let's try that once again. We're going to do raise lower by reference. For my reference point, I'm going to snap to this endpoint right here. And look at the elevation readout down here. It's set to 0. That's not what I want. I'm going to hit the tab key until it says an elevation that makes sense. 192.6. That's more like it. So now I'll click on that point and complete the command and say that I want a 2% difference. And now I see just a slight change in elevation on the building pad. And what's going on here is underneath this feature line is a parcel line, and that parcel line is at elevation 0. And the first time I snapped to it, I got the wrong elevation. I got the 0 elevation. So my building pad disappeared from view because it went way down to almost elevation 0. So now I'm just going to repeat that process for lot 28. I'll use the quick elevation edit command to figure out where my high point is. Here we're at 192.5, 192.6, 194.5, and sometimes it's a little tricky, 194.2. So once again, this lower left corner is the high point. So I'll escape out of that. I'll do my raise lower by reference. Once again, my reference point will be my high point. I want to be careful and use the tab key to make sure I'm picking the right elevation. I'm going to use 2%. And watch the 3D view over here. When I enter the 2%, you'll see that building pad raise up slightly. Actually, it was this guy right here. Repeat that once again. I'll assume that this is the low point, but let's check it just to make sure. I'm sorry, the high point, not the low point. And we'll use quick elevation edit. That's 195, 194.5, 194.2. 195.8, so that was a bad assumption. This is my high point this time near the road. This is 195.8, this is 195. So this time when I do raise lower by reference, I'm going to snap to this corner here. Once again, I want to make sure I'm getting the right elevation, so I'll click the tab key. We'll do a 2% slope. It's going to bump that up a little bit. And that successfully grades all the lots the same way that we did for lots 25 and 26. So we set the side lot line from the road elevation to existing, road elevation to existing, road elevation to existing. We set the back lot line to match existing, and then we set the building pad to be high enough so that it created at least a 2% slope with the perimeter of the lot. And that takes care of task number 2. For task number 3, we are asked to create a surface from the feature lines that we've used to grade lots 25 through 29. So I'll begin by going into Prospector, and I'll right-click Surface and say Create Surface. And I'm going to call my surface Lots 25-29. And I'll go ahead and use the Contours 1 and 5 design style. Then I want to add some feature line or some break lines to that surface. So in Prospector, I'll expand down to the break lines node, right-click that and say Add. And I'm going to use standard break lines. I don't need to weed any points because I want as many points as I can in this case. I do want to supplement, however. I may have some longer lengths, especially along the side lot lines where we've got over 100 feet of no elevation data. So I want to create some elevation data. I'm actually going to go every 10 feet, not every 5. And we've also got some pretty small curves, so I'm going to do a mid-ordinate distance of 0.05. Now how do I know 0.05? It's just from experience, knowing that I've got some really small arcs. 0.1 seems a little big to me, 0.01 seems a little too small, so 0.05 feels about right. Just a gut feeling from years of doing this. I'll click OK, and then I'm going to pick my feature lines. I could have done a select similar or some other trick, but there aren't a lot of them, so I'm just going to select them one at a time. And once I've got them all selected, I'll hit Enter, and hopefully we're going to see a surface pop up there. And that's looking pretty good. The contours are looking just about right. We've got the high building pad in the center, and all the contours kind of radiating outward from there. You know, if there was something I would add, I'd maybe create a boundary to clean it up, but really we're only dealing with a couple of extra tin lines here, so I think what I would probably do is go to Surface Properties and turn on the surface triangles. We've got a few extra triangles in here that we can remove. And one other thing I want to do, I'm looking at this void in the surface up here, and I'm realizing that I actually missed an important break line, and that's the red one out front. So I'm going to go in and add that. I'm going to click on it, and I'm going to add to surface as a break line. I want to add it to my lots 25 through 29 surface. Use the same settings that I used before. And now I'm going to get a little better definition along the front of the surface, but I'm also going to get some extra surface lines. So no problem. I'm just going to use some of my editing tools, my delete line, to get rid of that. And I'm going to use a little trick I learned called a fence. I'll type F for fence, and it lets me get a bunch of these quickly. I'll do the same thing down here. F for fence. That's looking pretty good. I think one more spot will do it. F for fence. And now we've got a nice little surface representing our lot grading for lots 25 through 29. Just so we can look at it a little bit more closely, I'm going to take it into Object Viewer. Make my Object Viewer a little bigger. Spin it around a little bit. If we zoom in closely, you know, the ground is pretty flat, but we can pick out the building pads and the swales in between. And that's exactly the kind of look we want for a residential development like the one we're creating. So that satisfies the requirement for task number 3, and that finishes the additional exercise for Chapter 16.